Well, good evening again, everyone. Hope everyone can hear me all right. So it's lovely to be back with you all again this evening, albeit virtually. So this evening, we're moving into the final two chapters of Fratelli, Tutti. And in many respects, I suppose these are two chapters that appealed to me a lot, purely because they're areas that I teach quite a bit about. So I suppose I was very interested to see what Pope Francis might do here when he speaks about these kinds of issues to do with war, reconciliation, the death penalty, and so on. And it's interesting for all sorts of reasons, but also, I suppose, from my point of view as a moral theologian, it's here where we start to see Francis really advancing and progressing moral teaching, magisterial teaching on these two areas. And I'll say a little bit about that when we get to it. So if we begin, and we see that the title for chapter 7 is Paths of Renewed Encounter. So we're back to this idea of encounter again, which really, I suppose, dominates much of this encyclical. Francis throughout is exploring the ways in which we can better encounter each other and live in right relationship with each other, whether it's at a more interpersonal level or at a societal level, or indeed here at a global level when we start to talk about these global issues that are very complex and complicated. So we're back to this idea of renewed encounter. How do we think afresh about our relationships and our interconnectedness, and how do we go about that business in a better way? And one of the earliest sections in chapter 7 is entitled The Art and Architecture of Peace. Now, I was really attracted by the language that Francis uses here, the art and the architecture of peace. And for me, this points to a kind of a twofold dimension of peace and of peace building. First is the architecture of peace. And this takes into account a whole range of different things, different structures, different facilities, different approaches to things that need to be in place if peace and if peace building is to get off the ground. So I suppose included here would be things like truth commissions, which Francis mentions, and South Africa is a very good example of the establishment of a truth commission to try to facilitate peace building and social healing in the aftermath of violence and harm done to a section of society. And they're not without their controversies, truth commissions, and they involve quite a considerable degree of compromise, as we saw in South Africa, indeed as we saw in Northern Ireland through the Good Friday Agreement. Sometimes we have to compromise and give up certain things in order to achieve others. So we may release early, for example, prisoners, people who have committed crimes, or we may not imprison at all people who committed crimes. Part of the Truth Commission structure was that many people who gave evidence of the crimes that they committed during apartheid would actually walk free at the end of this process. Now, that's an incredible compromise to make in the aftermath of violence, but it's part of a bigger agenda, namely to try to facilitate peace and healing and reconciliation. So Truth Commissions is, I suppose, one example of the kind of architecture that we might think of when we think of the architecture of peace. But we would also include many other things, such as securing and protecting human rights. So the establishment of human rights and their protection and promotion is a critical part of kind of the architecture that goes into a peaceful society. Francis also in this chapter mentions integral human development. And again, he's drawing from the work of his predecessors here, most notably the work of Paul VI, as we find it in Populorum Progressio, which was the great kind of blueprint almost for what integral human development looks like. Later popes, John Paul, Benedict, and now Francis, very much draw from Paul's teaching here. And integral human development includes a whole range of things beyond just what human rights rhetoric and legislation caters for. It includes all that contributes to human fulfillment and to human flourishing. So it's very broad and wide ranging, but we would certainly have to include the kind of things that contribute to integral human development, such as education and healthcare, the right to religious freedom, food security, adequate housing, job opportunities, all of these kinds of things, as well as the broader areas of life like culture and the transcendent dimensions of our lives, the spiritual and the religious dimensions. All of this feeds into how we understand integral human development. So that's part of the architecture, I think, also. But interestingly, Francis, in chapter 7, points to quite specific things. He talks about prisons, for example, and how we need to improve the prison conditions of hundreds of thousands of inmates around the world, many of whom are in really appalling conditions. So what can we do there to improve the living conditions of these people, and that we have a moral obligation to do that. He also talks about abolishing the death penalty. The death penalty is a very sort of real structural thing. It's a policy implemented by governments around the world to deal with extreme end criminals. But Francis calls on us to put an end worldwide to this practice. And he also then talks about war and warfare and the abolition of war. So these are the kind of things that I would include, at any rate, under what we might describe as the architecture of peace. If we're serious about bringing about a lasting peace, then we certainly need to be addressing these kinds of, if you like, structural, political, economic realities. But the art of peace, for me, points to something different. And earlier in Fratelli, Tutti, we encountered, it's probably a bad choice of words, we came across the phrase, the art of encounter. So Francis likes this idea of art, something being an art. And for me, it reminded me of a definition of morality that we were given when I was in first year in Maynooth a million years ago. And it was the then professor of moral theology, Pat Hannon, described morality as the art of right relationship with each other and with the world around us. Now, he was doing something very deliberate in that definition. He made no reference to God, for example, and he did that for a particular reason. But his use of the word art is significant, because if we think of morality as an art, like any art, whether you're trying to learn to play the piano or play camogie or whatever it is you're interested in, any art requires of us time and effort, staying power. It requires that we learn from our mistakes. It requires us to figure out and learn the skills of that art. So although you can play the piano without ever learning music, it does help if you can read music, and so on. So you have to acquire the skills in order to perfect the art that you are trying to acquire. And morality for Hannon is no different. Morality is something we must work at and try to perfect as best we can, and figure out as we go along. And the reason I suppose I'm focusing on this is because here Francis, I think, is also maybe slightly less directly pointing to that dimension of peace building, that it is an art, and it demands of us the learning, if you like, of this art, us trying to perfect this art. So it's taking us into the realm of truth telling, of which he speaks here in chapter 7. And that can be a very difficult thing to do, particularly in the aftermath of violence or harm or hurt done to us. It requires the sort of internal healing, you might say, and forgiveness that goes with this. It also, this art of peace building requires of us a questioning and a critique, that we can try to seriously engage with what has happened, learn from it, pass it on. He speaks here of intergenerational dialogue, for example, so that we don't forget our history and where we have come from. And he talks about the joy of acknowledging others. And again, he's back to this idea of encounter. And these are all, for me at least, more of the internal dimensions of peace building that we as individuals need to work at. How do we become better at building up right relationship? How do we become better at forgiveness? And so on. So for me, there's two dimensions of this. There's the architecture dimension, but there's the art dimension, the more personal level that we're called to engage with. So how does this bear out more fully? Francis here, for example, in paragraph 228, speaks about acknowledging the possibilities that others have a legitimate point of view, that others can contribute to our understanding of whatever it may be, can contribute to the process of healing and reconciliation, can contribute to a more inclusive and authentic society. So that we are open to what I describe as the possibility of surprise. We're willing to acknowledge the opinions and the insights of others and to learn from that. So we're not closed off to those encounters. Francis mentions also here the importance of creating more inclusive societies. Ones, as he says, that respect and acknowledge the different worldviews, cultures, and lifestyles that coexist in society. He speaks about beginning with the least in society. He calls for a renewed encounter with the most impoverished and vulnerable sectors of society. So again, we're back to how we see our moral vision. We're back to how we encounter. We're back to the art of encounter, the art of right relationship, the art of peace. And as I said already, a critical ingredient in this is, of course, human rights, the establishment, the protection, the promotion of the human rights of all human beings. And in paragraph 233, Francis explains that peace is not just the absence of war, that peace and peace building requires a firm dedication to and protection of human rights. It implies a commitment to integral human development, and so on. So we understand peace in a far broader sense, in a more holistic and joined up kind of way. We recognize that peace and peace building is intimately connected with poverty reduction, for example. It's connected to the securing and the safety of the natural world and protecting biodiversity. As natural habitats are destroyed, people are displaced, people have to move, communities become fractured and less stable, and so on and so forth. That peace building is connected to things like education, and in particular, I would argue for the education of young girls around the world. That peace building has to work towards, what would you say, properly dealing with people who are displaced, not just leaving them in camps for generations or in direct provision or whatever it might be. So there's a whole range of things that go into, if you like, peace building in the broadest sense. But of course, part of all of this is forgiveness and reconciliation. We live in a world that is deeply fractured and fragmented. We live in a world that is violent. We live in a world where great harm is being done to people, even as we speak here this evening. So how do we go about the business of forgiveness and reconciliation? And this is a very complicated, complex area. It's a deeply theological issue. But it's a deeply difficult issue just at the level of human beings. You know, it's very hard for us to turn the other cheek as we're being asked to do, or it's very hard for us to forgive. It's maybe easier to forgive something that is done to ourselves, less easy perhaps to forgive something that is done to someone we love. And again, in times of violence, you can see the great harm that is being done to people. How do we try to bring about forgiveness in a world that is so fractured and fragmented? And part of this are if you go back to the idea of the architecture of peace, part of this is things like Truth and Reconciliation Commissions or Good Friday agreements, that kind of thing. It is about the deployment of peacekeepers, as we know from our own context. And all of this kind of thing. The politics of it is critical. You need governments that will work together and so on. But an interesting feature of what Francis says in this chapter is the role that memory plays in this. And for Francis, memory and truthfulness and remembering rightly is a key part of this art and architecture of peace. I was really interested in what he was going to say here in this section, and I'd be interested to hear what you guys have to say about it also. Because as I was reading this, the work of Miroslav Volf came back to me. I think I've mentioned him to you earlier in one of our lectures. Miroslav Volf is well, he was born in Yugoslavia as it was then. He's a theologian, and he himself suffered abuse, mental abuse during his time in Yugoslavia. He was conscripted into the army, into the military, but he was married at the time to an American lady. So he immediately became suspicious to the authorities because they figured he was an American spy. So he was subjected to mental torture during his time in the military. And that really, shaped and affected him, needless to say. So he has written a lot on this idea of memory and how we remember rightly. And there's all sorts of reasons why just remembering or ethical remembering is important. But it is for Volf a key moral issue. If we do not remember justly, we become part of the cycle of injustice that is being done in a particular situation or in a particular context. So that sort of moral imperative to remember ethically, to remember rightly, is also mentioned here by Pope Francis. And can play an enormously important role in, as I said, peace building and reconciliation. Perhaps to bring it a little bit more into context, a couple of weeks ago, I was asked to launch a video for a neighbor of mine at home. She's a religious sister. And she put together a video to commemorate the 100th anniversary of the ambush at Clonfin. It happened just, a few miles from where I live. So it was an ambush that took place during the War of Independence. And during this ambush, 4 people were killed. They were 4 British soldiers. And the ambush at Clonfin was always sort of celebrated down our part of the way as one of these sort of, big events in the War of Independence. And you had these brave Irish men fighting the British soldiers, trying to secure Irish freedom. It was that kind of narrative. And that's certainly the narrative I grew up with. But what Sister Maeve did with this video to commemorate the 100th anniversary was to tell the story of the 4 British soldiers. And she visited their graves in 4 different parts of England. She learned about them, who they were. Some had young children when they were killed. Some had just been married. All had come back from the Great War and obviously survived it. And it was a really poignant retelling of their lives, a glimpse into who they were. And through that human encounter with these 4 people, in a manner of speaking, we realized that they were just ordinary people, no different to anyone else. They happened to be British soldiers, but they were husbands, they were sons, etc. And Sister Maeve, in doing this video, was, I suppose, a little nervous because she wasn't sure how this might go down locally. But it's interesting that her father and 3 of her uncles were involved in the ambush and were part of the party who did the killing, carried out this ambush and killed these 4 people. So in telling this story, she was saying that she was in no way trying to diminish the cause of Irish freedom or what the people during this period did or the values they were fighting for. But she said it never rested easy with me that we would celebrate something where the taking of life occurred. So for me, this was a really interesting project that she was involved in, and I think a very brave project. And it kind of captures in a way what this ethical remembering should be about. And Francis here in chapter 7 brings the question of identity into things as well. And I think where our identity is strong enough and where we're confident enough in who we are, we can look back and acknowledge the wrongs of our past and the mistakes of our past without diluting or diminishing the positives that might have occurred in the past also. So I think there needs to be that balance and that honesty and that integrity in how we go about our remembering. Francis then moves on to two very important topics here in this chapter. He speaks about war and he speaks about the death penalty. And within the Catholic tradition, the just war tradition, I suppose what we can start by saying is that there are two key branches within the Christian tradition more generally about how we ought to respond to society's problems, injustice, oppression, and so on. One is the pacifist branch. The other is what's called the just war theory. Now, whichever school of thought you belong to, both emphasize the importance and the necessity for the Christian to partake in social transformation. The pacifist claim is not a claim to sort of retreat from the world and hide away from the world. It's not a rejection of any obligation to change society and to transform society. But the pacifist and the just war theorist would have a different approach, a different strategy to how we might try to improve the world or change injustices and all the rest of it. The just war tradition is the one that came to dominate Catholic moral theology for the greater part of 2000 years. And the early Christian communities would have been largely pacifist. We move away from that in the 4th century when the Roman emperor converts to Christianity. Christianity becomes the kind of the sexy religion that everyone wants to convert to now. If it's good enough for the emperor, it's good enough for the rest of us. And the problem you find then is that you have large numbers of soldiers who want to convert to Christianity. So if you're a pacifist religion, how do you cope with that? And they turn to ancient Greek and Roman philosophy, and in particular to the work of a guy called Cicero, who was one of the key architects of the just war theory. And we start to incorporate that into our Christian theology. Now, the reason I'm saying that is because, as I said, the just war tradition has dominated Catholic theology more so than the pacifist tradition. If you look at other Christian denominations, you'll find that the pacifist tradition is much more evident and much stronger. All right. Here we have Francis speaking about war. And he makes the claim very strongly, never again war. He examines the impact, the consequences of war. He questions some of the more dodgy motives that we often invoke to justify warfare. He says humanitarian reasons are often cited, but there's usually, or there can be, ulterior motives for going to war. And in the end, he comes to the conclusion, war never again. Now, to my mind, this is the beginning of a conversation. I think Catholic theology needs to really start thinking about the implications of this and what it means. But it's interesting that there are some, at least, who much earlier began this conversation around war and what we call the abolition of war. And one such person was Enda McDonough. And the reason I'm mentioning Enda is because we buried him on Sunday. He was one of my heroes. So I've had a bad month of it, I'm afraid. He was a great guy and an amazing moral theologian. But Enda McDonough, along with the work of Stanley Hauerwas, coined the expression, the abolition of war. They called for an abolition of war. They have said that we have reached the point surely now where war can no longer be an accepted means of social transformation. We see the utter destruction that it brings, even if your motives are good. So there's a whole body of thinking, I think, that really needs to be developed around this. And I think the Catholic Christian tradition needs to, at the very least, get to a far greater embrace of what the pacifist has to offer, if you like, in this discussion. I'm conscious of time, and I haven't even gotten to chapter 8, but the final issue here that I just want to mention is the death penalty. And again, he's calling for the abolition of the death penalty worldwide. He's drawing from the work largely of John Paul II. John Paul was the first real sort of Pope to push this idea, really question the legitimacy anymore of the death penalty. And so John Paul advanced this discussion quite considerably. Francis is here now bringing this on also. The reason I'm interested in both what he has to say about the death penalty and the just war and abolishing war, let's say, comes under the umbrella of what we call a culture of life. It's a phrase that John Paul uses in his moral teaching. The great Cardinal Bernardin talked about a consistent ethic of life. That was his phrase. In either case, I think what's necessary and what's important is that we develop an ethic of life which is consistent and coherent and non-contradictory. It makes little sense to me as a theologian or as a person to say, for example, that I'm anti-abortion and I'm therefore pro-life, while at the same time being pro the death penalty or pro the war in Iraq, or we don't consider homelessness a problem, we don't consider access to healthcare a problem, we don't consider the war in Yemen and the famine in Yemen anything to do with us, and so on and so forth. And I think when we look at Francis's teaching, not just here but elsewhere, Francis is trying to get us around to understanding our pro-life commitment in a holistic, joined up way, so that we promote a culture that is truly a culture of life, that promotes the dignity of the human person in all stages of his or her life. It promotes the dignity of all people, irrespective of gender or ethnicity, irrespective of whether you're in a prison or you're not, and so on. So this is something I think that almost ideologically we need to have a sea change in terms of how we understand these kinds of categories, and in how we understand, if you like, almost the fundamental principles and the fundamental beliefs of our faith tradition, which are surrounded by principles such as the dignity of life and the sanctity of life. Chapter 8, he goes on, can be used to promote violence, manipulated to promote violence, and so on. And he also defends, interestingly, in that chapter, the role of the church to be part of the public sphere, the role that the church and churches, the church and other faiths, the contribution and the role that they will make to public life and to public discussion. And where they are denied a voice in public debate, that debate is impoverished. We lose something of the transcendent, for example, in those public discussions.